Right. So, just a really quick recap before we dive into talking about objectives in this snackable lecture. So, for this, just as a really quick recap, we had talked already about how to assess needs based on the four W's framework, how to identify what you're trying to train on, and whether it's the cognitive domain and what you want them to know, what you want them to be able to do, as in the psychomotor or the behavioral, and can you get them to appreciate the skill enough to be able to use it, which is the affective domain. We talked about adult learning principles, how adults simply learn differently. We talked about andragogy in one of the videos. Then last, we talked about Bloom's taxonomy. So just wanted to get that recap because everything really fits together. So with Bloom's taxonomy as our foundation in the last video, now we want to talk about objectives, and I want to break this down. This is talked about in the textbook, but very simply, we want to use four criteria for writing our objectives. Now, to back up for a second, objectives is probably what you can guess. It's what you sound like, what it sounds like, and that's what's your objective in the training session. What do you want them to be able to accomplish when they leave? And so most of the time we see objectives that have the sentence stem that says something like, by the end of this workshop, participants will be able to, and then you have a verb, right? Really important piece is that every objective must have a good quality action verb, and the verb must meet these different, the objective, I should say, must meet these different criteria. And so the verb that you pick is critically important. Verb that you pick, very important. And so let's work through these criteria. So the first is it needs to be observable. In other words, can you see them doing it? So let me give you an example. You would never want to start an objective with participants will be able to understand, or participants will value, participants will appreciate, right? So those are cognitive objectives or cognitive domain as well as affective, but you can't see it. And so it would be better to say they would be able to recite or articulate or explain whatever it is. So you've got to be observable. Otherwise, it's not a well-worded objective. Measurable, you got to be able to make sure they're doing it correctly, right? So for instance, it's not enough to just say it would be valuable for them to be able to script out a feedback form, an example of feedback. You want to be able to give them a specific piece of criterion by which you're going to assess that. So using a formula, or for instance, if you're doing a program on customer service and phone calls, right, to be able to deal with an angry customer, then you might say that by the end of the session, they're going to be able to conduct a phone call that's going to be able to reduce the number of complaints by 60%, right? So you would give it a very specific and measurable kind of a thing, kind of an objective. You want to make sure that it's realistic and that it's doable, right? Even in a long full day workshop, you got to be careful that you're not trying to accomplish too much, that you're not trying to do too much with the time that you have them. So just make sure that it's concrete. A really good way to think about your objectives in terms of attainability is what I like to call practice small. So I would encourage you, when you're writing your objectives, to ask, okay, is this small? Is it something they can do? Right? Can they practice 10 steps for something? Or would it be better to ask them to do 3 things, right? So just make sure that it's attainable, because one thing we know is that it's tempting to want to try to learn too much and apply too much from a training session. But we know that people need small, digestible steps and chunks to be able to apply, at least early on when they're trying to learn a skill, right? That's an important piece of it. And then we want to make sure that it's going to be simple and that it's going to be clear and concrete. One of the hallmarks of adult learning is you have to make it very specific. It's got to be something that people can learn and be able to use very simply in their work. So these four objectives, every objective you write needs to meet those criteria. So let's do just a really quick pop quiz, right? Some samples, and we can assess these together. So by the end of this training session, participants will be able to explain 3 techniques leaders can use to frame material. That's decent, right? It's observable. They can explain it. You could say that in some ways it's measurable, but it's not very specific. Frame material. Well, what does that mean? Right? So you might be able to be a little bit more specific with that one. How about this? Script out a feedback message utilizing the SBI formula. I think on this one, you could say that this one meets all the criteria, right? It's behavioral. You can see them scripted out. You're letting them know they have to use a formula, so it's definitely measurable. And if you think about it, it's pretty concrete as well. And then it's attainable, right? Writing out a message at the end of a workshop, I think, is doable. Then articulate the 3 factors necessary for executive presence. That one probably fairly attainable, fairly doable, fairly measurable as well. You might even list the 3 factors briefly just to give it a little bit more of a measurability quality. On this one, since we said articulate, it works. If we had said understand, it wouldn't work because you wouldn't be able to observe someone doing that. So avoid any cognitively based, any verbs that are cognitively based. How about this one? They will trust that Jeremy will teach them the correct technique. Well, that one is okay, except for the fact that it says trust. You can't really measure. Trust is not something that you can observe, right? I mean, we sort of intuitively know it, but it might be better to just say, articulate the correct technique for writing objectives or something like that. So be careful whenever you have those affective verbs like that. Last one, implement leadership tactics to improve communication in business operations. Wouldn't this be an awesome outcome if a training workshop would do this? Problem with this one is it may not be attainable, right? Obviously, you want people to get to that point, but what I want to encourage you to do with your objectives is break them down. Go small, right? So if this was an outcome of an entire program, that'd be great, but probably not a good objective for a single workshop. In the last video, we talked about Bloom's taxonomy. I want to combine these two things. So at the very top, you see the different learning objectives, you see the Bloom's taxonomy from knowing all the way to creating. Then this is a really good checklist to use. And what I would encourage you to do is when you're writing objectives, see which of these you've been able to use, right? Make sure you're not using words that are in the affective domain, like appreciate or even understand, which is really challenging. So instead, you can use discuss, identify, paraphrase, whatever it would be. And then when you're doing your lesson plan, you can make sure that you've got a variety. At the bottom here, you see a variety of methods that are going to allow you to achieve the objectives as well as work your way up Bloom's taxonomy. So there you have it, objectives now mapped on top of Bloom's taxonomy.